The American West is a land of endless horizons and unforgiving deserts. Imagine a time before cars, before planes, when crossing this vast expanse was a perilous summer-long journey, so long that during the course some people would die, others would be born, out on the trail. But America was growing, and some people thought it might be possible to build a railroad through the wilderness to link the country by steam locomotive. This iron horse, powered by steam and fueled by fire, was a game changer. It didn't tire, it didn't need sleep, and it could haul immense loads across incredible distances. Suddenly, a journey that once took the whole summer could be completed in under 2 weeks. The Transcontinental Railroad. It wasn't just about connecting two coasts, it was about uniting a nation. It brought people together, opened up new markets, and fueled the growth of the American West. In this video, we're going to follow that path across one of its most remote and desolate sections, the final miles before the meeting of the railroads at Promontory, and we'll find out what other relics and curiosities are out here along the original Transcontinental Railroad. Over the last decade, the BLM really improved the old railroad grade north around the Great Salt Lake. It used to be a risky drive, with old railroad spikes damaging tires and collapsed trestles that can swallow your entire vehicle. But now it's a pretty smooth dirt road that runs along the top of the lake near the Nevada border, all the way to Golden Spike National Historic Site. The trail bypasses the old trestles now, and it's graded well enough that most four-wheel drive and all-wheel drive vehicles can handle it. You could probably cover the whole trail in a long afternoon, but we wanted to take our time and explore. So we set up camp for the night near the sun tunnels, close to the old site of Lucin, the official western starting point of the BLM's Transcontinental Railroad Backcountry Byway. Before the sun went down, we checked out a curious spot marked on the map as a fistful of art. It turned out to be a collection of artistic structures, kind of mix of Burning Man art and, well, maybe just a bunch of junk welded together, depending upon how you look at it. Either way, it was definitely unique. I loved the photographic opportunities it provided. First thing in the morning, we had a visitor, a desert fox who maintains a permanent residence at the sun tunnels. These tunnels are another fascinating example of land art out here in the desert. Built in the 1970s by Nancy Holt, they're 4 large concrete tubes that align with the sunrise and sunset points during the summer and winter solstices. Something I found interesting, the holes in the top of the tunnels are arranged in the shapes of the constellations Draco, Perseus, Columba, and Capricorn. Holt's idea was that the tunnels bring the cosmos down to Earth. She was also married to Robert Smithson, another artist who created the Spiral Jetty, which we will see later on this trip. Lucin might not have been the biggest or the most important stop on this line, but it's definitely one of the most well-known today. It's probably because it gave its name to the Lucin Cutoff, built straight across the lake in the 1930s. Interestingly, the actual town of Lucin moved around quite a bit, eventually becoming a key watering spot for the steam engines. Picture this. It's the 1860s and you're responsible for keeping those massive steam engines moving across the vast desert. Where do you even begin to find enough water? Those engines needed huge amounts of water for steam in addition to the wood or coal that fueled the boilers. Regular watering points were essential along the entire railroad. Out here in this dry landscape, that's a serious engineering challenge. Constant water deliveries to keep the trains running weren't always reliable in an area this remote. The solution? A pipeline stretching all the way from the springs in the Pilot Mountains to the south to Lucin. An incredible accomplishment for the time. Today, not much is left of Lucin. You can still see some dugouts and this strange concrete structure that looks kind of like an old telephone booth. It really makes you think about how things have changed out here. Bovine, named after the nearby mountains, is a great example of a small section station along this line. These stations were pretty basic. You'd typically find a few maintenance workers and some support staff, all living in what was called a section house. Their main job? Keeping the section of the railroad running smoothly. These stations served a few key purposes. First, they had sidings, which were basically like passing lanes for trains. Remember, the Transcontinental Railroad was a single track for much of its length. So if a train was coming from the opposite direction, one of them would have to pull over onto the siding and wait for the other to pass. The stations also had water tanks to top off the steam engines, essential out here in the desert. and they usually had a freight platform too. This was vital for loading and unloading goods for local ranchers, homesteaders, or miners. It was their connection to the rest of the country. Many stops along the railroad were even smaller than Bovine, with just a siding and a small freight platform. Can you imagine how important these tiny stations were to the nearby settlers and communities that they served? This was once Terrace. Can you believe that this was once a bustling railroad town? If you look around, it's hard to imagine. But Terrace was actually one of the most important railroad centers in Utah. It all started in 1869 when the Central Pacific crews arrived here. They chose this spot because of its strategic location, even though there's no water to be found. But they needed water for the steam engines, and they needed it for the people. So they did what any resourceful engineer of the 1860s would do: they built a pipeline. This pipeline brought water all the way down from the Grouse Creek Mountains, about 15 miles away. It was an incredible feat of engineering at the time. Terrace quickly grew into a major hub. They had a roundhouse, repair shops, a depot, a hotel, even a library and a park. It was a real community in the middle of the desert. At its peak, Terrace had around 300 people, including railroad workers, their families, and those who supported them. It even had its own Chinatown. It was one of the largest Chinese communities in Utah at the time. The Chinese workers played a vital role in building and maintaining the railroad. But like many railroad towns, Terrace's fate was tied to the tracks. When the Lucin Cutoff was built across the Great Salt Lake in the 1930s, it bypassed Terrace entirely. The town lost its importance, and the people started moving away. A fire in 1903 destroyed much of the business district, and by 1904 the railroad moved its division point to Nevada. Terrace was downgraded to a section station, and eventually it faded away almost completely. Today not much is left, but if you look closely you can still see the traces of its past. The foundations of the buildings, the remains of the maintenance roundhouse, the old cemetery, and even pieces of that incredible water pipeline. It's a reminder that even in the most desolate places, history has a way of leaving its mark. And I came across some fascinating stories about the life in Terrace. It seems like it was a pretty wild place back then. There were stories of robberies, shootings, even tarring and feathering. One article described a grand ball held in 1873 to celebrate the completion of a new schoolhouse. Another told of a Chinese couple who got married in 1890. There was even a report of a dishwasher who stabbed the hotel clerk in 1899. But these stories give you a glimpse into what life was like in this remote railroad town. It was a tough place. This is literally the Wild West, but it was also a place of community, resilience, and even a bit of excitement. At Terrace, we detour south to visit Terrace Mountain to see Elephant Arch, but more importantly to invade the micronation of Zaqistan. I guess the border's closed. Probably makes us an invading army.
We're undocumented immigrants.
Yeah, exactly. Zaqistan is another cool land art installation in the desert to check out. It's a really interesting place that deserves its own side story, including the problem we found that throws its already tenuous legal status right out the window. Check that video out if you want to know more. There's way too much to say about Zaqistan in this video, so we head back to the rail line to continue east. This is Kelton, or at least what remains, a ghost town marked by these weathered headstones. Kelton sprang up in 1869, another vital stop along the Transcontinental Railroad. Like Terrace, it faced the challenge of water scarcity in this arid landscape, and like Terrace, they found a solution, a pipeline bringing water from miles away. But Kelton was more than just a railroad town. It became a major gateway to Idaho and Oregon, a hub for stagecoaches and freight wagons. At its peak in 1880, it had a population of 137, hotels, stores, saloons, even a schoolhouse, all the signs of a thriving community. But as the railroad expanded, new lines were built, and Kelton's importance began to wane. The Oregon Short Line diverted traffic, and then the Lucin Cutoff bypassed it completely. By 1904, Kelton was just a shadow of its former self. The decline was slow, but inevitable. The population dwindled, businesses closed, and the once thriving, bustling streets fell silent. The railroad itself finally pulled out in 1942, leaving Kelton to the elements. And here we are, decades later. The cemetery is one of the few things that remains. These headstones, they're not just markers of death, they're markers of life. They tell the stories of the people who built this town, who lived and worked and died here. It makes you think, how many places like Kelton have faded away, leaving only broken headstones as their legacy? How many stories have been lost to time, forgotten even by the descendants of those who lived here? By visiting these places and sharing their stories, we keep the memories alive. We prevent them from fading completely into oblivion. We ensure that the lives of these hardy people who built the West against all odds are not forgotten. And that's why it's still interesting to walk among these headstones and read their names out loud. Names that might otherwise be forgotten. As the railroad era faded and towns like Kelton slipped into obscurity, a new form of transportation was literally taking flight: the airmail service. It was about to revolutionize communications and travel across the vast distances of the American West. In the early 1920s, the U.S. Postal Service took on the challenge of creating a reliable airmail network. It wasn't easy. There was no radar, there was no radio navigation, and no GPS. Early pilots flew in open cockpits, battling unpredictable weather and relying on visual landmarks for navigation. Imagine flying across this terrain in those kind of conditions. To improve safety and reliability, especially for night flying, the Postal Service built a network of lighted beacons, usually in remote locations powered by diesel generators. Tall towers with rotating lights that could be seen for miles. They guided pilots through the darkness, ensuring that they stayed on course and reached their destination safely. This concrete arrow is one of the remnants of those beacons. They all had the same basic design so that a pilot could find them in the distance, and then look at the arrow on the ground, which pointed the way to the next beacon. The first transcontinental airmail route was completed in 1920, stretching from New York to San Francisco. It was a major milestone in aviation history, cutting delivery times significantly, but it wasn't until 1924 that regular night flying was established, thanks to these beacons and the dedication of the pilots and ground crews. Interestingly, the Post Office Department played a crucial role in developing the infrastructure for commercial aviation. They established airways, communication systems, and navigational aids, paving the way for the modern airline industry. By 1927, all airmail was being carried by private companies under contract with the Postal Service, marking the beginning of commercial aviation as we know it. So as we travel along the remnants of a railroad linking the nation, it's important to remember that the spirit of innovation didn't end there. It evolved to new levels with the airmail service, connecting the country in ways never before imagined. The Transcontinental Railroad Backcountry Byway officially ends at Golden Spike National Historic Site, where you can see the last bit of railroad grade as a one-way scenic drive. It's a cool little drive, but today we're heading south to check out something unique. The Spiral Jetty is another example of land art. This one built in 1970 by Robert Smithson, the husband of the woman who built the sun tunnels on the other end of the drive we just made. It's a massive spiral of black basalt rocks extending out into the Great Salt Lake. Smithson chose this location specifically for the reddish hue the water takes on in summer when certain bacteria and algae bloom in the high salinity environment. The jetty's story has a history of disappearing and reappearing with the fluctuations of the lake. A few years after it was built, rising lake levels submerged it completely. Then in the 1990s, the lake receded, revealing the jetty once again, encrusted in a thick layer of salt. I was actually lucky enough to see it at this point. The pure white landscape in the pink water and the orange sunset was a truly alien world to experience here on Earth. Over time, the elements have washed away the salt, and now, with the ongoing drought and water diversions for agriculture, the lake has receded even further. The shoreline is now about a quarter mile away from where it was when Smithson built the jetty. It really makes you appreciate the ever-changing nature of this landscape. Just east of the Spiral Jetty is another curious sight, the Roselle oil seeps. Here, oil and tar naturally ooze to the surface, creating thick, sticky pools, kind of like the La Brea tar pits but on a smaller scale. These seeps have been known to trap animals, and the local university research department actually keeps track of the creatures that become stuck. They found pelicans, coyotes, mice, owls, and all sorts of smaller animals and insects. It's a bit sad, but also a fascinating example of the natural world at work. Roselle Point has a long history with oil. It was one of the first places in Utah where oil was produced, with attempts to extract it dating as far back as 1904, and eventually had 30 to 50 wells operating at one point. But production was difficult. The oil quality is low, so refining costs were high, and the rising lake levels made things even more challenging. Eventually, the field was abandoned in the mid-1980s. When the lake levels are low, like they have been for the past few decades, the seeps become these sticky pools along the old oil drilling jetty. We even saw a bubble of water emerge up through the center of one of the seeps. It's not something you see every day, and just another example of the strange and unique things you can find in the Great Salt Lake Desert. And that brings us to the end of our journey along the Transcontinental Railroad Backcountry Byway. We've covered a lot of ground, both literally and figuratively. We've explored abandoned railroad towns, marveled at land art, and witnessed the ever-changing nature of the Great Salt Lake. We've learned about the challenges of building a railroad across this unforgiving landscape, and we've seen how those challenges were met with some amazing ingenuity. We've also caught a glimpse of how the nation's travel routes have constantly evolved. From the early days of the railroad to the rise of the airmail service, we've seen how innovation has transformed the West, connecting people and places each time in ways never imagined by the generation before. But most importantly, we've encountered the stories of the people who lived and worked along this historic route, from the railroad workers who built the line to the artists who found inspiration in this bleak landscape, and how they've all made their impact on this often overlooked part of the West. I hope you've enjoyed this journey, and we can see you next time. Click those buttons below if you want a heads up for when the next trip comes out. Thanks.